Henry asked me to kind of summarize what I took away from today, and as I spent 29 years in the Air Force, I was taught, if nothing else, 3 main points. So I said, we'll go to 3 main points. The first one was probably the last area of discussion, and this was really, I was quite taken with this, but the elephant in the room, although at this place, the Republican Club, I should say the donkey in the room, was sort of the question of classification and secrecy. I have to say that one of my mentors was Edward Teller, and Edward was a great opponent of classification, and he made a point which I think is really telling, that you don't beat an adversary by imitating them, and I think that's what we finally did that in the Cold War. We stopped imitating the Soviets, but I think today we are, in some sense, more secrecy prone than any of our economic or military or cultural adversaries. And we saw that here today. I mean, there was a last minute issue. I understand that people from the Defense Department weren't supposed to say anything because they know things. Fortunately, when I left the government about 4 years ago, they had that flashy thing you see in science fiction movies, so I don't know anything anymore. So if I speculate on something, it's which I won't, by the way. But I think that the one of the things that this community needs to do is figure out how we can discuss these issues about proximity in space, threats in space, cyber warfare in space, and so on, in an open fashion. And this was something I think that was pretty good agreement, that this is just basic physics. I remember when I was a young scientist working for the Air Force, I got on a Princeton PhD committee. That was an accident, but a Michigan grad on a Princeton PhD committee. Even worse, I had an Arizona PhD. But the one good thing about Princeton PhDs, at the end of it, you get to ask a question, but it can't be about the dissertation. So I asked the young man, I said, how big are the U.S. spy satellites? Of course, the other members of the committee all had clearances. And so he went through first principles, and he was remarkably close. So they all asked me, was that right? I said, I don't know, it's classified. But those are the kind of things I think we need to do. So the first thing I want to leave with you is we really ought to push hard. But these are things that can be discussed without getting into cosmic secrets, intergalactic secrets. The second item, and this was one that I was really pleased to see that there was a lot of discussion on, is that and Jamie talked a little bit about this as well. The new directions in space are not being run by governments. They're being run by the private sector, and some of those are pretty dramatic. And we don't have very many of those folks here. I know some of them, so the next one I'll arm twist them. Some of them used to work for me. For example, the Planet CEO, he almost got me put in jail over ITAR violations. But now he's providing them separately. For those of you who don't know, Planet has like 300 satellites. They've launched little satellites and bigger ones that take images everywhere once a day. Something that certain 3-letter organizations wish it could do. But at any rate, he's an interesting guy, Will Marshall, if you ever met him. Flaming red hair, looks like a communist, it is. But I need to tell you his real vision, and this is important, because most of these people, they may be focused on doing things on Earth, but they really have a true focus. His real dream is to settle the moon. And, I can't get into things I sign a non-disclosure with them, but they're going to do this in the next decade. They've enlisted the help of a number of Silicon Valley high net worth people, including Eric Schmidt and a few others. This is a fundamental change. And I think as a community, if we're going to figure out, rules and so forth, we need to look at what happens beyond Earth orbit. And nobody's done that. One of the things in my long-standing ill-spent career, I got to know Newt Gingrich pretty well. And so Newt and I have been corresponding back and forth about the Space Force. And we both agreed that the Space Force doesn't make any sense until we have true economic activity in deep space. We have people living other places. And that's going to happen. But this is a thing we need to understand. I mean, people like Bezos, who until a week ago was the world's richest man. Now I think he and his ex are third or fourth or something. But he's made a point that we should move heavy industry off the Earth, and he intends to do that. We ought to reserve the Earth for light industry. And I was reminded when he told me that about 15 years ago that when I was a graduate student, there was an organization called the Astronomical Society of the Pacific that liked to make these smart aleck bumper stickers. And the one I wish I knew where it was. It said, "Save the Earth." This was, one of the, and then below it says, "Let's strip mine the other planets first." And so I think that this is to understand that they may be making money doing satellites looking at Earth or doing something, but virtually every one of them believes in a solar system-wide society. So that's something we ought to pay attention to. The third one is that we discussed, and Doug and I are sort of soul brothers in this one is we're techies, and the amazing thing about technology is all of our predictions will be wrong. That some things are going to go a lot faster than we can imagine, other things a lot slower. But it's and I was actually taken by Brian, your thing that whether making an agreement on robotic space threats is the biggest threat. It's something we can do, and it's so I think that it's important to be very mindful of the technology and how it changes things, but it's also important to understand that it's very, very hard to predict. And if you're going to make an agreement or a framework, that technology is soon going to prove you wrong. And in fact, my first argument with Newt Gingrich was, he's a historian, and he said, well, all you needed to do was study past history and all the, people have already thought about all these things. And I told him, I said, well, technology changes things. And he says, name one thing. And I said, nuclear weapons. That was the end of the argument. That those kind of changes are coming. And we don't know what they are. We can guess. My particular guess is things are going to get a lot smaller in space. There are swarm satellites that are coming up. And I'm going to leave a final thought here that often our challenge in the United States, and this goes to secrecy as well, is our own people. About a year ago, a friend of mine, Sarah Sarangelo, had a company called SwarmSat. And they wanted to launch their first system, and they got an export license and were going to launch it on an Indian booster. And they were getting, well, you got to get this license and that license, and the FCC wouldn't give them a license. And so they actually called me over and asked me what I thought, and I said, you should not ask me. I'm not an attorney. You can't even use the excuse you talk to somebody knowledgeable, because I got in trouble about this kind of stuff. But I said, you can make two choices. You can either, seek forgiveness or permission. And they decided to seek forgiveness. And they launched this stuff, and it was a big issue. She almost got put in jail and lots of issues. But the interesting thing was she was actually right, because this technology is going to change everything. Those kind of little chips I showed you, you can launch thousands of those, and they can work as a concert. And that's a lot different when you start talking about, what's proximity ops. Who knows? Those will be over thousands of kilometers. The worrisome thing to me is that if we end up getting into these arguments today, some of them legalistic, some of them policy, we're going to lose this argument, because while she was arguing about this, there were 3 or 4 Chinese articles about them launching the same thing, and they did it because they read about what she was doing. And so I think if I leave a final thing is you need to stop government bureaucrats from giving licenses if you want the U.S. to do well. Guidelines are fine, licenses are bad. That's all I've really got, and this was really fun. You know, I hope there'll be more of these. So if there's anything I can do to help, I'd be happy to help. Anything other than promising my billionaires money. They've made it very clear that's their promise, not mine.
We're doing, we don't need your money.
Good, good. All right, well, this was fun, and it was fun to see. You have to finally, you know, when I first had a lot to do with Henry, he was working for Senator Dan Quayle. And so I'll leave this story. And there was a meeting, and I probably get the details wrong, but he was one of there's what, 4, 5, 6, you know, supporters of the Star Wars program. And they all had staffers like Henry that were really smart. And General Abramson had just been hired as the head, and I was his special assistant. So we put together this master briefing. It was like 12 charts. And so they wanted to see it before we formalized it. So I got sent over with another major legislative liaison guy. So they were having this meeting, and there were people coming in and out of the meeting giving me a hard time about this is wimpy, and I guess squish would be the current word. And so finally there was this blonde-haired guy who started asking me questions. And I told him, I said something like, I'm getting tired of people without technical backgrounds telling me what. And I asked him what their background was, and it was policy and law. And so he left. And so I asked the major, who was the asshole? He said, that was Senator Quayle. and so he comes back in and says, you get your boss over tomorrow, we're going to fix this briefing, Major. Okay. So I come with a 3-star general and the next day, and Quayle's really spun up, and Henry's there. It was terrible. So, you know, I don't know those guys that know the General Abramson, but butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. He's the smoothest guy. And he was completely nonplussed over this. And the way out, he said, what do you think got in him? I don't know. He must be just feisty. And, but it gets better. I don't know, a month or two later, Henry called me. And he says, what are you doing on Saturday? And I said, I don't know. Who asked? He said, well, the senator has a debate on SDI and wants you to come and get him ready for it. And I said, why me? And he said, well, you were one of the few guys who were honest with him. And I didn't have the heart to say, I didn't know who the hell he was. But anyhow, that was really fun. A really neat guy. And I later worked for then Vice President Quayle at the White House and the Space Council. But
he was ambitious enough to want to be free.
Yep.
People did not understand that about him. I think one person came up to him after one presentation, like the one your boss had to give. And it was, I always thought you were an airhead, but listening to you, I have to rethink that.
Pretty cool guy, so it was really fun working for him at the White House. Thanks again for inviting me.